This series of videos has been a very long, winding journey, to put it mildly, but we are now at a point where all of the various threads of this narrative can finally begin to converge, and we can thus begin to expand our scope beyond the realm of human historical evolution and into the cosmic domain. What better place for such a convergence, then, than where it all begins? What better place than Eden? Within most Abrahamic religious traditions, the story of the Garden of Eden is typically regarded as the initial and most traumatic tragedy of human existence. It is seen as the great mistake, a rebellion against the divine order which was born out of ignorance and hubris for which all human beings must now suffer. As we will see over the course of this video, this sense that the fall of man was a great mistake or original sin is very much understandable, but ultimately myopic and misleading. What we find in the myth of Eden is very much a tragedy, but a central tragedy within a cosmic narrative which is itself hell-bent upon the generation of tragic beauty of the greatest intensities imaginable. What we find in the myth of the garden is, I will argue, the initial descent within a kind of collective hero's journey, which is ultimately aimed towards the most ultimate realization of numinosity. In previous videos of this series, we have already begun to sketch out the correspondences between what we see in the myth of Eden and what we see in the psychological notion of birth trauma. The uterine state of a developing infant is one in which there is not yet any sense of division between the selfhood of the infant and the body of the mother. As Stanislav Grof's work illustrates, the uterine state is one of oceanic, undifferentiated awareness, which, within the unconscious, tends to be associated with motifs of paradisiacal serenity, Arcadia, Elysium, Shangri-La, and, of course, Eden. Within contemporary psychology, we find a number of different theories of what trauma is and how it functions. Ronnie Janoff-Bollmann's shattered assumptions theory is one prominent example, and we find numerous variations within psychodynamic theory, object relations theory, and Lacanian psychoanalysis. I'm not going to go into detail breaking down each of these different perspectives because for now it suffices for me to say that I don't find any of these theories to adequately penetrate into the core of what trauma truly amounts to, insightful though they may be. Rather, I want us to begin by returning to a seemingly unrelated topic which we touched upon previously, the British polymath Gregory Bateson's theory of schizogenesis. According to Bateson, schizophrenia is fundamentally a failure of self-delineation, which begins in the initial negotiation of boundaries and trust between infant and caregiver, though the most significant caregiver in this dynamic tends to be, of course, the mother. Bateson suggests that schizophrenia begins with what he refers to as a double-bind situation. The mother might be abusive, emotionally unresponsive, or prone to substance abuse, but the child nevertheless finds itself to be physically and emotionally dependent upon the mother. Such a double bind thus results in a kind of contradiction within the child's life and psyche, which it is unable to navigate. If such a double-bind situation unfolds at a sufficiently young age, the consequences can be catastrophic for the long-term stability of the child's developing ego, as the development of the human sense of selfhood begins with a kind of negotiation of boundaries between the infant and mother. The human ego is itself a kind of semi-permeable membrane between the internal and external, and the shape of this membrane is far more fluid and dynamic than we often tend to realize. The significance of the relationship between infant and mother lies in the fact that the most basic shape of this ego membrane comes to develop through the separation of the infant's sense of selfhood from that of the mother. Within the uterine state, there is no such separation. The infant experiences no such boundary between self and world, as it experiences its own awareness as continuous with the body of the mother, which is, in effect, the world of the infant. Following birth, however, the first layer of this boundary between interior and exterior comes to form, as we examined in more detail previously. Subsequently, the infant must come to develop a coherent sense of selfhood, which will come to be shaped by relationships of dependence, independence, and trust, which come to form between child and mother. When this process of egogenesis is distorted by a double-blind scenario, the developing ego fails to achieve a stable basis of its own coherence, thus conditioning the possibility of schizophrenia in later adulthood. Bateson's understanding of schizogenesis is crucial here in that it points us towards the most fundamental dynamics of trauma and, by extension, the most basic dynamics of human ego formation. The shape of the ego membrane is conditioned by relationships of trust and fear, as well as by self-narratives and the ideals which are implicated within those narratives. Trauma, at the most basic level, is the breakdown or rupture of those boundaries which delineate self and world. As the shattered assumptions theory also implies, traumatic events are those which cross the line of what we presume to be possible or comprehensible. Trauma is not simply pain, but rather it is the sort of pain which cannot be rendered comprehensible within the horizons of sense-making which condition the shape of the human ego. Trauma thus creates a sort of wound within the ego membrane, which then requires the boundaries of selfhood to be renegotiated, regenerated, and reterritorialized. As such, we can therefore see that birth trauma is in fact the most quintessential form of trauma itself. The fissioning apart of the infant and mother is an extremely painful and dangerous process, and through this process, the most basic form of selfhood, the uterine unified oneness of self and world, comes to be violently ripped apart. The birth trauma is the initial wound of human consciousness, and the regeneration of this wound results in the most basic morphology of human subjectivity. So now let us look more closely at what we see in the myth of Eden. We have a state of paradisiacal oneness which humanity is violently expulsed from. This expulsion is said to have occurred due to Adam and Eve eating fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So what exactly is this fruit? What exactly is needed in order to discern good and evil? Here again, we should consider the most obvious feature of human consciousness which divides us from other types of animals. Although tool usage can be found in various forms of non-human animals, the human capacity for artifice is something which is rare if not completely non-existent within non-human nature. A monkey can see that a certain rock might be useful for smashing open a shell. The monkey can clearly discern the forms which are actually present within its field of sensory awareness. A human, however, can do something that the monkey cannot. A human being is able to look at a stone and see that the stone could be an arrowhead, a stone knife, or an axe head if the stone were carved in the right ways. Through such manipulation, the stone ceases to be a mere tool and becomes an artifact. In order for such artifice to be possible, it is not enough for us to perceive the forms which are immanently present within the stone. We must further be able to see the possibility of the arrowhead or stone knife or axe head, which is latent within the stone but concealed. In other words, the human being must be able to behold the arrowhead within his mind as an idea, as a concept which can be regarded independently of what the actual stone is presently. This capacity for perceiving forms in themselves is something which we see in all expressions of human art, artifice, and language, but it is also precisely this ideational or imaginal faculty which allows us to experience the contrast between the ideal and the actual, the contrast between good and evil. Unlike other forms of animal consciousness, the ideational power of the human psyche allows us to experience what should be in contrast to that which actually is immanently. What this illustrates is that the ideational power of the human psyche is the source of the rupturing apart of the transcendent and the immanent, a duality which we have explored at length in our examinations of form and formlessness in previous videos. Our sense that the natural world is fallen or contaminated is one which arises through our capacity to contrast the discordance, indeterminacy, and uncertainty of immanent actuality with the world of ideals, which we perceive through ideational awareness. Through this rupturing apart of the ideal and the actual, we come to experience a sense of alienation from the world we inhabit, a sense that we are beings from some other world, one which we have been violently cast out from. Embodied corporeal existence comes to appear as a sort of punishment or curse which must have befallen us due to some great transgression of the celestial order. The journey of human spirituality begins as we experience the light of the idyllic, transcendental realm and the correlative dread, which arises as we find ourselves seemingly trapped within a world of darkness and imperfection. Boundaries are crucial for all living organisms. Cell membranes must carefully mediate between what is accepted into or expulsed out from the cell. Dermal layers likewise maintain the division between self and world for more complex organisms, and immune systems must be able to meticulously discern which entities within the organism are part of the greater whole and which are contaminants, toxins, or parasites. But here we must recall that living organisms consist of various compositional layers, or compositional strata, which govern different organizational principles. Using the terminology we established previously, these are the somatic, vital, sentient, dianoetic, and subjective organizational principles. We could also use the terminology of the Western esoteric tradition here, referring to these principles as the mineral body, etheric body, astral body, mental body, and the soul. Flora, such as plants and fungi, are divided from the world at the level of the vital or etheric body. Unlike animals, plants have no internal engine of sentience which guides their motion, behavioral patterns, instincts, and impulses. The floral division between self and world, therefore, is strictly vital, metabolic, physiological, and immunological. Floral seeds or spores are moved about by the wind or are carried from one place to another by animals such as bees or bats. We could say that the forces of sentience act upon flora externally, as they have yet to be internalized in the manner we see in animals. We should also notice here that the vast majority of flora are hermaphroditic. The organisms express both masculine and feminine sexual organs and germlines. Recall that in our previous discussion of the transition from magical consciousness to mythical consciousness, what we saw was a transition of human self-identification and self-locality. Within the magical structure, the human sense of selfhood was localized within the vital plane. As the magical structure gave way to the mythical structure, the sense of selfhood came to be localized within the sentient plane. While the magical structure is characterized by monodimensional resonance or synchronicity, the mythical structure, correlated with the sentient plane, is characterized by bidimensional polarity. It is here that we encounter the division between what Jean Gebser termed the death soul and life soul, and which I have termed the stellar soul and lunar soul. It is also within the mythical structure that we saw the polarization of human thought as our world picture came to be divided into yin and yang, light and darkness, form and formlessness, underworld and overworld. Given that polarization is a core motif of the sentient or astral plane, it is thus unsurprising that we see sexual dimorphism in animals much more prominently than in flora. While flora are divided from the world at the level of the vital body, fauna are divided at the levels of both vital and sentient bodies, as fauna have internalized the sentient principle within themselves. This internalization results in a greater degree of separation from the world and, significantly, a correlative intensification of sexual energy. While non-human animals are divided from the world within the vital and sentient layers of reality, the human ideational faculty results in a creature which is divided from the world within the vital, sentient, and dianoetic layers. Our sense of selfhood is not simply physiological or behavioral, as our capacity for ideation results in the human organism becoming an inner world of images, concepts, and symbols, an inner universe, which stands in contrast to the outer world of immanent actuality. Our sense of alienation from reality is thus far more acute than that of any other organisms, and as such, human libidinality is likewise far more intense. This is not necessarily to say that the bodily sexual impulses of the human organism are more powerful than any other creatures, but rather it is to say that our sexual drives are more than bodily. Unlike what we see in other creatures, human libidinality is not simply a kind of bodily function. It is a very much spiritual impulse, which is ultimately driven by the exact same sense of alienation which also drives the human spiritual, religious, and artistic impulses. The symbols of the forbidden fruit, the serpent, and even the Garden of Eden itself tend to be laden with heavily sexual connotations, and this is no accident of art history. There are no such accidents. The fruit of the tree of knowledge is, as we have already seen, the fissioning apart of the transcendent and immanent, and the correlative delineation of the human being's inner world from the outer world. This sense of existential separation conditions the need for existential reconnection, and as such, human sexuality and religiosity are far more intimately related than might initially be apparent. So now, let us look more carefully to the symbol of the serpent. Within the myth of Eden, it is the serpent which tempts Eve with the forbidden fruit. Given that most Abrahamic traditions regard this as a great transgression of human existence, it is unsurprising that the serpent tends to be associated with malevolent figures such as Lucifer or Satan. Such an interpretation is not entirely incorrect, as we will see later on, but it is, however, extremely superficial and obfuscates the many layers of symbolism contained within the serpent. One significant indication of the serpent's symbolic meaning is to be found within the Kundalini yogic traditions of India. Yogic practice is intended to facilitate the ascent of Kundalini energy through the chakras, which are localized along the human spinal column. The chakras, as previously indicated, correlate with the various ego structures which have developed over the course of human history, as earlier structures of consciousness have come to be submerged beneath later structures. The ascent of this Kundalini energy, the ascent of the human ego, is symbolically represented by the serpent, which climbs upward through the chakras of the human spine in much the same way that serpents climb trees. Given what we have established thus far, it should be rather clear that the process depicted here is isomorphic to the process of human ego evolution, which we have examined throughout this series. Moreover, we can here infer that the serpent is in fact a symbol of human subjectivity itself. If we interpret the serpent within the myth of Eden as being essentially the exact same symbol but cast in a somewhat different narrative role, then many of the implicit layers of this narrative will begin to come into focus. The serpent is the human ego, the human sense of selfhood. The serpent is also the evolutionary impulse itself as indicated by the Kundalini tradition, and the serpent is the will unto self-transcendence, which we could in fact refer to as Luciferic, if we are to properly understand the meaning of that term, a topic we will be addressing in more detail later on. Moreover, if we take into consideration the correspondence between the chakras and the tree diagram, which we have been piecing together over the course of these videos, then we can see that the tree of knowledge within the myth of Eden and the human spinal column within the Kundalini tradition are also gesturing towards the same underlying archetype, a toroidal, recursive morphology which expresses the interpenetration of the corporeal and the psychical, and which we find to be the most basic morphological structure of life itself. So, here we can infer that the serpent is considered to be responsible for luring Eve into the realization of the ideational consciousness represented by the fruit of the tree of knowledge, because the serpent is both subjectivity itself as well as the evolutionary impulse of life itself. And as will become more evident later on, these two meanings are in fact one and the same. Due to its contribution to the alleged fall of man, the serpent is said to be cursed to crawl upon the surface of the earth. Many have taken this to indicate that prior to the alleged fall, the serpent possessed legs and was therefore some sort of lizard or dragon-like being prior to being cursed. However, there is no actual indication of this within the text, and if we continue to peel back the layers a bit further, what we will begin to see is something much stranger and much more metaphysical than a lizard being transformed into a snake. Here we must ask a seemingly naive question. If the serpent was not crawling upon the earth before the fall, then where was it? In order to answer this question, we now need to go off on yet another tangent by addressing the notion of Adam Kadmon, which we find within the Western and Near Eastern esoteric traditions. Adam Kadmon is said to have been the most primordial form of the human spirit, which existed prior to the fall from Eden. Oftentimes, Adam Kadmon is said to be the transcendental archetype or Platonic form of the human being, an interpretation which, once again, is true in a sense, but potentially misleading. We find a deeply significant clue as to the nature of Adam Kadmon within a very curious motif of Christian iconography. Within many depictions of the crucifixion of Christ, we find a human skull located either at the base of the crucifix or buried beneath the hill of Golgotha. Within this scene, the blood of Christ flows down from the cross and then into the skull of Adam. Taken in a superficial way, this would seem to be a rather convenient coincidence, that the physical skull of the first Adam would happen to find itself beneath the execution of the second Adam. But here we must understand that this skull is itself a symbol, one which represents not a specific human individual, but rather the mineral body of the earth itself. What is being indicated here is that the mineral shell of our planet is in fact the skull of Adam Kadmon, and that the blood of Christ is initiating the Christification of our planet. The philosopher and esotericist Rudolf Steiner tells us that the evolution of our solar system began with a vast nebulous sphere of warmth, which he refers to as ancient Saturn. Moreover, Steiner tells us that this embryonic form of our solar system was also the embryonic body of man, the first phase in the evolution of the Earth and of Adam Kadmon. Needless to say, this narrative is rather at odds with the neo-Darwinian myth of human origins, but frankly, if you've made it this far, I assume you're willing to hear me out. In order to make sense of what Steiner is suggesting here, we need to carefully consider what he means in saying that the body of Adam Kadmon consisted of warmth. But first, we must rewind a bit and return to our consideration of how subjectivity arises from pure awareness, a topic we addressed in the previous video. As we have already seen, awareness, in the most general sense, is itself pure formlessness. It is, in essence, nothingness, as the formlessness of nothingness is, in fact, pure receptivity to feeling, pure experientiality, as Plotinus unwittingly discovered in spite of himself, and as various traditions of Eastern mysticism explicitly indicate. In a truly primordial, undifferentiated state of reality, one which we could correlate with the notion of Wuji within Taoism or the undivided waters of Sumerian cosmology, this pure awareness would constitute the whole of reality. This awareness would have nothing to be aware of other than itself. This infinitum of pure feeling thus initiates a recursive loop, a self-mirroring, which, as previously illustrated, results in the fourfold crucifixion of being into becoming, thus forming the basic structure of subjectivity within which we see the basic compositional motifs of reality itself to be implicated. This transformation of pure awareness, of pure no-thingness into subjectivity is something which we find explicitly within the German phenomenological tradition. Previously, we already examined the way in which Gottlob Fichte elaborated upon the works of Immanuel Kant so as to arrive at the insight that subjectivity is nothing other than self-positing self-identity, a self-conceptualization within which the concept of I is in fact the concept of unity itself. Later, Schelling and Hegel would further elaborate upon this insight in their examination of how self-identity emerges from what they refer to as absolute identity. But Hegel further complicates this picture by showing us that this self-reflection necessarily involves negation. The I can only be delineated and thus rendered intelligible insofar as it is able to define itself in contrast to what it is not. If pure awareness is nothingness, that is, pure negativity, then subjectivity is, as Slavoj Žižek would say, the negation of negation. This I amness is therefore less than nothing, and paradoxically also the most basic form of something. The role of negativity here is crucial insofar as it indicates that even in the most basic form of subjectivity, a boundary comes to form between internality and externality. In our examination of the nature of space in Part 3, we saw that subjectivity and spatiality both emerge within a kind of fourfold structure of relationality, which implicates the geometry of both the sphere and the tetrahedron. It is also worth noting here that among the other Platonic solids, only the tetrahedron is self-dual, further indicating its intimate relationship with the self-mirroring of subjectivity. To borrow imagery from Giordano Bruno, we might imagine that the infinite oneness of the absolute, or Wu-ji, comes to be punctuated by innumerable glimmering sparks of subjectivity. While the absolute itself in its most primordial state was only able to experience its own oneness, these sparks are now able to experience the otherness of the world around them, and it is in this feeling of contrast between self and otherness that we find what Rudolf Steiner saw as the warmth body of Adam Kadmon. Here we must understand that difference itself is a kind of friction or dissonance which implicates a possible resolution. An object thrown high into the air can be said to contain a kind of potential energy which demands release. The separation between the object and the earth is a kind of dissonance which demands to be resolved. Likewise, a block of solid ice is able to maintain a kind of separate self-identity. In its solid state, the block maintains the boundaries which divide it from the world around it. As the block of ice becomes warmer, however, these boundaries dissolve, and the water then attempts to spread itself out upon the surface of the earth so as to conform itself to the earth's morphology. The water may be absorbed into the soil or into the surrounding atmosphere as it relinquishes its self-identity in an effort to resolve the friction between self and world. We refer to a loving embrace as warm, and to passion as fiery. We refer to a lack of emotional response as frigid, and coolness quite literally numbs biological bodies. The physicalist paradigm of modern science insists that all things must somehow be reducible to mechanical, unconscious interactions, and as such, our science textbooks tell us that warmth is no more than the vibrations of microscopic physical objects, which no one has ever seen and no one ever will. If we set aside such dogmas, however, and allow the phenomenon of warmth to speak for itself as it actually appears before us empirically, we can see that the duality of warmth and coolness is in fact a duality of feeling and anesthesia. We can also see that coolness is necessary for the maintenance of individual self-identity, a point which will be highly significant later on. The feeling of warmth is the intensification of the feeling of contrast between self and otherness. As entities become warmer, they become less tolerant of the dissonance of such contrast and move towards resolution of such differences through merging with one another. Warmth is an archetype which we can see at work across all of the compositional strata of our world and of our own inner worlds. The warmth which causes the ice block to relinquish its identity is an expression of the exact same principle which we see in the emotional warmth which causes us to let down our psychological guards in relation to other beings. The former example is expressed within the physical and vital planes, while the latter is expressed within the sentient and mental planes, but both are expressions of the archetype of warmth. Returning now to the sparks of subjectivity, which were the initial building blocks of our reality, we can infer that the most basic feelings experienced by these sparks would have been feelings of warmth, feelings of contrast between themselves and the world around them. As with all inner feelings, this inner warmth would then come to be expressed outwardly, thus creating auras of thermal radiance, which would have constituted the first expressions of physical existence. A notion which might lead us to question the physicalist interpretation of the so-called cosmic microwave background radiation, but that will have to be a story for another day. During the initial formation of our solar system, and presumably all other solar systems, the primordial sparks of subjectivity would come to coalesce so as to form the titanic sphere of warmth, which Steiner termed ancient Saturn. Here we should note that, at this stage, these innumerable sparks of subjectivity are not yet individualized beings. They are all expressions of one and the same self-reflectivity of the absolute, or in other words, they are all instances of the same I amness. In order for this oceanic, unified subjectivity of Adam Kadmon to differentiate itself into individuated, particular subjectivities, our solar system would need to create individual bodies which were capable of experiencing themselves as individual, inner worlds through ideational perception. The subsequent evolutionary history of our solar system would be a process aimed towards the realization of such individualized subjectivity. This would be a process of densification and division, just as we see in all other forms of morphogenesis. For the vast majority of that evolutionary journey, all of the organisms which constituted our solar system would have been effectively organs of the same all-encompassing subjectivity. This, then, is the sense in which our entire solar system is, in fact, the body of Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is the primordial form of the human spirit because the essence of the human is not the biological species Homo sapiens. The essence of the human is subjectivity and the evolutionary impulse which is implicated within such subjectivity. Before returning to Eden, I want us to first look more closely at some topics which pertain to the evolution of our solar system, and the archetypal dynamics of such a process. As previously suggested, evolutionary processes unfold through divergence and densification, and the most clear-cut illustration of such processes can be seen within the dynamics of human reproduction. Here I want us to return to the polarization of the human ego which occurs during the development of the mythical structure, the sentient layer of human subjectivity. As we have already seen, this polarization results in the emergence of the stellar soul and lunar soul, two distinct structures of self-conceptualization which counterbalance one another within the human sentient body. Within one of my previous videos, titled The Esoteric Metaphysics of Music, we examine the way in which the duality of stellar and lunar principles correlates with the harmonic duality of major and minor. The stellar principle can be seen to govern clockwise motion around the circle of fifths, perfect fifth intervals, major thirds augmented chords, the whole tone scale, and triadic geometry. The lunar principle then correlates with counterclockwise motion, perfect fourths, minor thirds, diminished chords, the octatonic scale, and quadratic geometry. Looking to the triadic nature of the solar principle, we can note that the triangle is the simplest shape which can be composed of straight lines, which expresses a boundary between internality and externality, thus indicating a relationship with self-conceptualization and therefore a relationship with ideation. This boundedness also indicates a relationship between the triangle and the circle, a shape which is likewise bounded but which consists of only a single curved line. This relationship between the triangle and circle also mirrors the relationship between the tetrahedron and sphere mentioned previously. The circle indicates curvilinearity, and looking to the world of living physiology, we can see that curvilinearity is associated with expansion and growth, as organisms become more curvilinear as they store fat within their bodies. Quadratic rectilinearity, conversely, correlates with densification and contraction. Bones are the most densified organs of animal bodies, and animals tend to become visibly more rectilinear as they become emaciated. As such, we can see that the solar principle is associated with expansion and growth, while the lunar principle is associated with contraction and densification. However, we might begin to notice a bit of a paradox here. If the solar principle is associated with curvilinearity and expansion, then it would seem that the solar principle should be associated with femininity, while the lunar principle of contraction and rectilinearity should be associated with masculinity. Within most human culture forms, however, we see quite the opposite. The solar tends to be associated with masculinity, while the lunar tends to be associated with the feminine. However, we can indeed find mythologies within which this polarity is reversed, and in doing so, we can begin to see the emergence of a deeply revealing pattern. Within Old Norse mythology, the sun goddess Sol is associated with feminine nourishment, while the moon god Mani is associated with stability, solidity, and fate. We see similar patterns of lunar gods and solar goddesses within the Uralic peoples of Eurasia, as well as within Baltic mythology and within the mythologies of Native American tribes of the northernmost regions of North America. What all of these cultures have in common is that all of them were geographically and culturally quite far removed from the cradles of sedentary civilization which emerged following the Neolithic Revolution. These were cultures that remained far more entrenched within their shamanic, tribalistic, and animistic heritage than did the great civilizations of Mesopotamia, the Mediterranean, or the Yellow River Valley. In other words, these were cultures which retained a living connection to the magical structure of consciousness, even as this structure came to be submerged beneath the mythical structure within most other culture forms. So, recall again that the emergence of the mythical structure from the magical is the development of the sentient layer of the human ego, which then comes to envelop the vital, tribalistic ego of the magical structure. It would therefore seem that within the magical structure, which identifies the self as the vital body, the lunar principle is identified as male, while the solar is identified as female. Within the mythical structure, which identifies the self as the sentient body, the solar is identified as male, while the lunar is identified as female. What this would all seem to indicate is that the feminine vital body is in fact solar, while the feminine sentient body is lunar, and that the masculine vital body is lunar, while the masculine sentient body is solar. Human sexual dimorphism would thus appear to be a kind of mirrored polarity, much like two magnets with inverted poles. Within more magical culture forms, we tend to identify ourselves as being the vital body, and thus tend to identify the solar as feminine and the lunar as masculine. As the mythical structure takes hold, however, this polarity flips as we come to identify ourselves as being localized within the sentient plane more so than the vital. The vital body is the compositional principle of physiology and metabolism. It is the vital body which guides the morphogenesis of the organism's physical form. We see the solar principle expressed within the female body as expansion and curvilinearity, but it is also expressed in the fact that the female body is regarded as an object of libidinal pursuit. The solar principle is that of valuation. It establishes that which is worthy of value and therefore that which is worth striving towards. We see the lunar principle expressed within the male body as the rectilinearity of its much sharper angles. The quadratic lunar principle is one of densification, and healthy male bodies tend to be much firmer than female bodies, and male bones also tend to be far more dense than those of females. Psychologically and culturally, the male body tends to be regarded as almost a sort of instrument or tool. Male bodies are valued on the basis of what they can practically do, while the female body tends to be regarded as an object of value in and of itself, for better or for worse. While the female body is seen as something of value which is in need of protection, the male body is seen as an instrument of protection. Or in more dysfunctional modes, the female body is seen as a prize to be violently conquered, while the male body is seen as a disposable tool. Within the sentient plane, the realm of behavioral patterns, drives, impulses, and instincts, we find this polarity reversed. The solar nature of the male sentient body inclines it towards the future, towards progress, achievement, exploration, conquest, or independence. It is a deeply goal-oriented form of behavioral patterning. The lunar nature of the female sentient body conversely inclines it towards establishing a sense of safety, stability, and regularity. Just as the sun mediates between present and future, the moon mediates between present and past. And within that consideration, we can see another aspect of the female sentient body's lunar nature. In his introduction to the 1944 edition of Grimm's Fairy Tales, the Irish poet, novelist, and playwright Padraig Colum colorfully illustrates the way in which folk tales were situated within the rhythmic flows of the pre-modern life world. Colum notes that folk tales traditionally belong to the domain of the night, of the moon. In a world with scarce artificial lighting beyond candles, the transition from day to night was a transition between two qualitatively distinct rhythms of life activity and attunement of consciousness. Within the fading hours between dusk and sleep, folk tales were typically passed on to children by mothers or grandmothers. Even within the diurnal world, folk tales tended to be passed on among women and children who were engaged in housework rather than among men who worked outside of the home. Women and girls would spend many hours working textile looms, and during these hours, folk tales would be ceremoniously recounted. Here we should recall a detail which we noted in part 2 of this series, the way in which the symbol of cloth within the tragedy of the Oresteia repeatedly indicates the influence of the lunar Artemis. The weaving of yarn and the weaving of tales both facilitate the flows of the past into the present, the unification of distinct generations within the family, the embrace of warm sheets like the nurturing, protective shell of Cancer. Thus far, I've stated that masculine physiology is lunar while feminine physiology is solar, but this is an oversimplification in certain respects. Recall our previous observation that sexual polarization occurs within the sentient body, responsible for behavioral patterns and instincts, rather than the vital body, which is responsible for physiological forms. But just as the vital body is able to give shape to the physical, the sentient is also able to shape the vital, and this influence is particularly evident in human reproductive organs. The masculine phallus is expansive, outward-oriented, and goal-oriented. It is very much solar because it accords with the polarization of the male sentient body, not the male vital body. Conversely, the feminine womb is vacuous, receptive, and contractive. It is lunar, again in accordance with the sentient body rather than the vital. The menstrual cycles of the female reproductive system accord with lunar cycles, hence the common etymological roots of the words month, moon, and menstruation. What this shows us is the resonance between the lunar spirit and the feminine sentient body, which governs female reproductive physiology. Here we can now begin to consider the archetypal movements of human reproduction, and in doing so, we can begin to see the underlying principles of evolution which are absent from Darwinian natural selection. While Darwin was able to clearly see the dynamics of survival and reproduction, he was unable to perceive the dynamics of divergence and sacrifice. As previously noted, the solar principle is that which mediates between present and future. It is, among other things, the principle of adventure, of growth, of the archetype of the hero, and of the ultimate values which draw us forward through life. When a child is born, the solar principle of the mother's vital body is, at least partially, relinquished to the child. It is now the child which is seen as the value in itself, which must be protected and nurtured. Likewise, the solar principle of the father's sentient body must also be sacrificed, at least in part, to the child. The father is now no longer the hero or protagonist, but rather must now become the guide and tutor of the child. Both father and mother must relinquish their own orientation towards the future and densify. Their habits and lifestyle must come to stabilize and solidify such that they can now establish the stage upon which the child's story can begin to unfold. The solar will unto individual destiny is passed on to the child, and the parents come to be stewards of a destiny which is no longer strictly their own. What we see here is therefore a very specific sort of archetypal dynamic. The child diverges from the mother and carries the torch of the solar principle within itself as the mother and father both come to densify through their sacrifice of this solar evolutionary impulse unto the future. What I will next be arguing is that this exact same dynamic of divergence and sacrifice can be seen within the entire evolutionary history of biological life and, by extension, the entire evolutionary history of our solar system as a whole. Within the orthodox mythos of modern science, the essence of humanity is understood to be no more than the biological species Homo sapiens. As such, the existence of humanity is said to have begun some 300,000 years ago, give or take, when the first anatomically modern humans are said to have emerged from among the various other forms of hominids, which themselves diverged from the higher primates between 6 and 9 million years ago. Needless to say, the narrative I will be attempting to articulate here will be quite different. As we have already begun to see, the solar principle is future-oriented and evolutionary, while the lunar principle is one of densification, solidification, and inheritance. The solar spirit is, therefore, one which prolongs adolescence, leading to the retention of the potentiality and generality of the more juvenile form. Adolescence itself is a kind of potentiality, or plasticity. As a child ages, this raw potentiality comes to harden, as it were, as behavioral patterns and predispositions come to solidify, habits come to form, and the vast branching tree of future possibilities comes to be carved down as decisions are made and pathways unto the future are selected from among the range of possibilities. As the warm formlessness of raw potentiality gives way to the ingression of concrete forms, there is a sacrifice of generality to specialization. The solar retention of potentiality is something which we can see in the vital body of the human female. The voice of a male child is often much more similar to that of an adult female than an adult male. Women also tend to be physically smaller and with more curvilinear facial features which are more similar to those of adolescents. But just as we can see these dynamics of solar plasticity and lunar densification within the human life cycle, we can also see these exact same dynamics in the evolutionary history of biological life itself, if we are able to look to the biological world with a clarity that is unclouded by the physicalistic ideology of modern science. The Prussian philosopher Johann Herder referred to the human organism as the creature in the middle. In this statement, Herder is gesturing towards his observation that unlike other kinds of animals, the human organism lacks specialized organs such as claws, fangs, wings, venom-producing glands, or protective shells. Unlike other creatures, the human form is ever in the middle, at a crossroads of indecision, as it were, which entails both a radical vulnerability as well as a radical freedom. Human beings possess three different types of teeth: incisors, canines, and molars, each of which are utilized for distinct purposes: cutting, tearing, or grinding. Within the human dental arc, all three types of teeth are united in a kind of triadic balance, wherein no one type is dominant above others. Within other types of mammals, however, we see pronounced gaps within the dental arc, which facilitate the dominance of one type of tooth over the others. Rodents privilege their incisors, using these teeth to cut through hard surfaces and to shred through food, which would otherwise be too large for such small creatures. Carnivorous mammals such as wolves, tigers, and lions are canine specialists. They use such fangs to hunt prey and tear apart flesh from their quarry. Ungulates specialize their molars for crushing and grinding vegetation. If evolution is a process of adaptation, of molding the organism to accord with a specific kind of biological niche, then it would seem that the human organism is the least adapted among other types of mammals. When we look to the dental arches of these non-human mammals in their embryonic stages, we find a very similar triadic balance as that which we see in adult humans. But as these organisms develop, this balance is sacrificed to specialization. Looking to skeletal anatomy, we can see the exact same pattern. The human hand consists of 5 fingers, each in balance with one another. The human hand is an organ of ultimate generality. It can be used to grasp objects, to thread needles, to groom bodies or hair, to play pianos or guitars, to type on keyboards, or to punch with balled fists. Looking to other creatures, we can see that this extreme generality has been sacrificed unto various forms of specialization. The bat's fingers have been elongated so as to form the framework of wings for flying. The fingers of the penguin have merged together so as to form an almost fish-like flipper. The fingers of the horse have been fused together so as to form hooves, which are specialized for running across rough terrain. Looking to the fossil record of horse evolution, we can see that there is indeed a clear trajectory from more humanoid generality to more animalistic specialization in the emergence of the horse's hooves. The notion of ontogenetic recapitulation was first rigorously theorized by Ernest Haeckel during the 19th century, as Haeckel attempted to synthesize the works of Lamarck, Goethe, and Darwin into a systematic theory of biology. This notion, often known as the biogenetic theory or recapitulation theory, suggests that as individual organisms develop morphogenetically, they recapitulate the evolutionary stages which led to the genesis of that species. In a phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Morphogenesis is a cumulative process. Developments which take place very early within embryological development lay the groundwork for developments which will come to be fully realized much later in the organism's life cycle. As such, alterations to the organism which occur very early on in development will give rise to much more drastic alterations of the adult form, while alterations which take shape later in development can be much less drastic. As such, evolutionary developments tend to work their way backwards through the life cycle of the organism. Alterations begin to take shape within late stages of development, and only later in the process of evolution do these alterations begin to be expressed in earlier stages of development. This would then explain why organisms tend to be much more similar as embryos, yet diverge from one another over the course of their ontogeny. According to orthodox neo-Darwinism, human beings diverged from chimpanzees over 6 million years ago, and it is heavily implied that this common ancestor would have been much more ape-like than human-like. However, if we look to the ontogeny of chimpanzees, we see quite the opposite. The skeletal structures and muscle distributions of juvenile chimpanzees are strikingly more humanoid than adult chimpanzees. Juvenile chimps are able to rotate their heads much more freely in a much more human-like manner, while the heads of adult chimps are much more sunken down into the shoulders and therefore are much less mobile. The chimp's snout also comes to be much more pronounced as it ages, as the premaxillary bone comes to elongate. This elongation is present in virtually all non-human vertebrates, but the premaxillary bone is retained within both human beings and juvenile chimps. If we look to the overall tendencies of evolutionary history, we see that this is a general trend. The animals which are allegedly less evolved, that is, those with features which came about earlier in evolutionary history, tend to have much more pronounced premaxillary bones and snouts, while those which are allegedly more evolved tend to have less pronounced premaxillary bones and shorter snouts, until we finally arrive at human beings, where we find that the premaxillary bone comes to be fused into the skull behind the incisors. Thus, it would seem that either evolutionary time is somehow moving backwards, or that the allegedly less evolved creatures are those which have had more time to diverge ever further from a fundamental archetype which was characterized by generality rather than specialization. The commonality between juvenile chimps and adult humans is often explained away as being the result of paedomorphosis, a process by which juvenile features are retained into adulthood. This is effectively the exact opposite of the biogenetic principle. Paedomorphosis is a genuine phenomenon which we can see most notably in creatures such as cats and dogs, which tend to retain many more juvenile features than their wild cousins. This theory would imply that human beings are, in effect, chimpanzees which have come to maintain our adolescent features throughout our life cycles. But this does beg the question: if the distinctly human features of extreme generality were already present within the embryonic and juvenile forms of higher primates, and this generality could not have arisen from specialization, then this extreme generality must have been retained throughout the evolutionary history which gave rise to the higher primates. As we will see later on, empirical evidence also stands in contradiction of this paedomorphic explanation. Undifferentiated generality can evolve into specialization, but specialization does not evolve into generality. As such, the existence of the extreme generality of the human form demands a very radical conclusion, that the lineage of humanity must have been an unbroken continuity of generality, which other forms of life came to diverge from over the course of evolutionary history. The trajectory of evolution always moves from the universality and balance which characterize the human, and into the particularity of specialization. In the words of Johann von Goethe, animal evolution always finds itself at dead ends. The human, however, does not. The orthodox mythos of human evolution indicates that anatomically modern humans did not emerge until roughly 300,000 years before the present. This neo-Darwinian narrative implies that as we look further back into geological history, we should find human ancestors which are less human and increasingly ape-like in physiology, in accordance with the notion that our common ancestor with higher primates was far more primate than human. If we look to modern textbooks and popular science media, we find only archaeological evidence which supports this narrative. However, if we begin to dig a bit deeper, pun intended, then a very different story begins to emerge. In 1863, one of the founding figures of modern archaeology, Jacques Boucher de Perthes, discovered an anatomically modern human jawbone along with various stone tools and bones of extinct animals at an excavation site in Moulin-Quignon, France. These findings were discovered within geological layers which are believed to be around 430,000 years old, far older than what the orthodox timeline of human evolution would indicate. Following these discoveries, critics attempted to explain away these findings by insinuating that the bones and tools had been stolen and planted at the site by local hoaxers. However, the historian of science Michael Cremo, in his 1997 publication The Later Discoveries of Boucher de Perthes at Moulin-Quignon and Their Impact on the Moulin-Quignon Jaw Controversy, delves further into subsequent excavations conducted by Boucher de Perthes in an effort to corroborate his initial findings. Within these subsequent excavations, which were overseen by Boucher de Perthes himself as well as several other expert witnesses, hundreds of anatomically modern human bones and teeth came to be unearthed within the same geological layers. As Cremo's publication illustrates, these subsequent findings were almost entirely ignored by the scientific communities of England and France and are today almost unheard of. Within his 1999 publication, Forbidden Archaeology in the Early and Middle Pleistocene, Evidence for Physiologically and Culturally Advanced Humans, Cremo details numerous archaeological findings which defy orthodox timelines of human evolution. Notable among these examples is the case of the Buenos Aires skull. In 1896, workers dredging for the creation of a dry dock breached a layer of solid limestone about 11 meters beneath the surface and uncovered an anatomically modern human skull. The geological strata within which the skull was uncovered indicates it to have been between 1 million and 1.5 million years old. Argentine paleontologist Florentino Ameghino initially attempted to classify the fossil as belonging to an as-yet undiscovered species of hominid. Other paleontologists disagreed, however, arguing that the skull's features were exactly like those of modern humans and, therefore, that the skull could not have been as old as the location of its discovery indicated. In 1966, the geologist Virginia Steen McIntyre joined an excavation team working at the Hueyatlaco site near Puebla, Mexico. These excavations uncovered various stone tools, including stone blades and scrapers. These artifacts were located within Pleistocene strata, clearly at odds with the orthodox position that human beings have only existed in the Americas for some 16,000 years at most. In 1973, Steen McIntyre and her colleagues would utilize 4 independent dating techniques in order to verify the age of the artifacts: uranium series dating on animal bones, zircon fission dating and tetrahydration dating on volcanic ash, and mineral weathering analysis. These methods of dating converged upon a range of 250,000 to 370,000 years for the strata within which the artifacts were uncovered, and subsequent studies would also corroborate this dating for the strata in question. In 1981, Steen McIntyre's findings were published in the journal Quaternary Research, but unsurprisingly, these findings have been almost completely ignored by orthodox archaeology. This is but a small sampling of archaeological findings which contradict the orthodox timeline of human evolution. Within the text Forbidden Archaeology, Michael Cramo and Richard L. Thompson document many hundreds of such examples. Some of these examples are more dubious than others, to be sure, but even if a single one of these examples is legitimate, then that necessarily entails that the orthodox narrative of human origins is simply false. These various threads of evidence all seem to indicate that distinctively human creatures existed alongside or even prior to the existence of the more ape-like hybrid creatures which are proclaimed to have been our ancestors. If that is indeed the case, then that necessarily raises the question: who exactly evolved from who? The conclusion we should draw here is not that human beings sprang into existence fully formed and have remained physiologically unchanged for all of the Earth's history. Seen within the context of previous observations that the essence of the human is in fact the generality and universality from which specialization comes to arise, the conclusion that we can draw here is that the human species did not come about by diverging from higher primates. Rather, the higher primates, and indeed all other forms of life on this planet, came about through diverging from us. Here we can now begin to put all of the pieces we have sketched out thus far into their proper places. If we see evolutionary history as a gradual divergence from the human, then we can retrace this timeline backwards towards a sort of alpha point, which mirrors the omega point theorized by Teilhard de Chardin, a primordial stage of the evolution of our solar system in which these divergences had yet to take place. Or, in other words, the ancient Saturn stage of our evolution in which our entire solar system was in fact the primeval warmth body of Adam Kadmon. As previously noted, we can see the specialization of non-human animals as a densification of human plasticity and generality. More advanced creatures, such as primates and mammalian carnivores, are much more generalized and plastic than more primitive creatures such as plants or bacteria, which operate in much more deterministic, procedural ways. These more primitive creatures diverged from the golden thread of human evolution much earlier in the history of our world, and have thus densified much more thoroughly over the course of the subsequent aeons. Looking to the mineral kingdom, we see the organisms which diverged from us during the most primordial stages of our evolution, the crystals, stones, and metals which constitute the skull of Adam. In our previous comparison of flora and fauna, we saw that plants and the most primitive animals have not internalized the principle of sentience. They are moved about by forces outside of themselves. Higher animals, conversely, are moved from within, as the sentient principle has come to be internalized within the individual organisms. In human reproduction, we see that the solar principle of evolutionary progress is bestowed to the child, who then carries this light forward as the parents come to densify, so as to create the foundations upon which the child can come to grow. Within evolutionary history, we can infer that the exact same process has been at work as the solar principle has been carried forward by the human evolutionary lineage, and all other organisms have come to densify in various ways as they have diverged from us. Some might see this understanding of nature as overly anthropocentric. To that, I would say, yes, this view of nature is aggressively anthropocentric, and I feel absolutely no need whatsoever to make any apologies for that. The human being is not merely one species among others, let alone some sort of virus which has come to contaminate the supposedly immaculate natural world. The human is the evolutionary principle itself. We are the destining of time. Anthropocentrism is often regarded as a kind of hubris, which has given techno-capitalism free rein to bleed our planet dry. But the narrative which we have illustrated thus far is one in which all other life forms around us, up to and including the mineral body of the Earth itself, have come about by sacrificing the solar principle to us. At every point of divergence, the human continued to carry this principle forward as non-human creatures came to assume their roles in the background of the human narrative. What this sacrifice entails is a sense of obligation and responsibility to the biosphere, one which goes far beyond the life-denying performative self-flagellation of so-called deep ecology. Within human beings, it is ideation which comes to be internalized, but even this is only the beginning of the much more nuanced process of human ego evolution, within which the various compositional layers of reality come to be incorporated into the human sense of self-conceptualization. The I-amness, which is the boundary between human subjectivity and the intersubjectivity of the external world. It is that process of internalization, which we have seen within Jean Gebser's The Ever-Present Origin. So, with this context to guide us now, let us return to the question which we initially left hanging in the Garden of Eden. What was the nature of the serpent before it was cursed to crawl upon the earth? Within the book of Isaiah, we see a kind of prophetic initiation in which the titular Isaiah experiences visions of the throne of God. Above this throne, Isaiah sees the seraphim, mysterious angelic beings which circle aloft above the divine throne. Each seraph is said to have had 6 wings, 2 which cover the angel's lower body, 2 which cover its face, and 2 which are used for flying. The word seraph can be translated as burning one, indicating that these angelic beings consisted of divine fires. This is in itself unsurprising. As we've seen previously, fire is understood within traditional symbolism to be the most spiritual of all elements found in nature. The highest heavenly realm is said to be the Empyrean, a realm which consists of divine fires which penetrate into our world through the stars, which act as conduits of sorts. However, the word seraph can also mean serpent. The etymological connection between fire and serpents pertains to the burning sensation caused by a serpent's venom. This connection is more than a mere analogy, however, as it indicates a connection between the spiritual nature of fire and the spiritual nature of the serpent as a cosmic symbol. Unlike the other 3 alchemical elements, fire requires sacrifice in order to sustain itself within the terrestrial world. Moreover, this sacrifice is not only the destruction of matter, but also the transformation of matter into spirit. As we've noted previously, the thought forms or ideas which constitute the spiritual domain can be understood as composite images of sorts, which are abstracted from particulars so as to create images of universals. If a mental manifestation of a universal is a composite image, then a mental manifestation of a particular entity must then be a picture. We can thus understand picturing as a more fundamental form of thought than conceptual abstraction, and within nature, we find such picturing to be the primary function of light, which is produced by fire. Burnt offerings are thus quite literally the rendering of the corporeal unto the psychical. The understanding of serpent venom as a kind of liquid fire thus indicates a highly significant spiritual connotation. Venom is understood to spiritualize matter in much the same manner as fire, but this venom is also understood to be a syzygy of 2 fundamental elements. Fire, which is associated with the realm of psychical forms, and water, which is understood to embody the formlessness of the cora or prima materia. So here, I believe, we find a hidden layer of meaning which also seems to be physically hidden from Isaiah by the seraph's wings. Isaiah evidently sees little more than, presumably, flaming wings, and so he never sees what the bodies of the seraphim actually look like. Yet, if we take the linguistic connotations here as seriously as the ancient Hebrews undoubtedly did, then we can see what Isaiah could not, that these seraphim were in fact winged serpents of divine fire. Within Rudolf Steiner's elaboration of the celestial hierarchy, which was originally schematized by Pseudo-Dionysius, the seraphim are regarded as the highest order of angelic beings. The seraphim are regarded as spirits of cosmic time, which govern the evolutionary impulse and ultimate destiny of reality through the ultimate organizing principle of love. Within Steiner's thought, as with the Western esoteric tradition more generally, love is not simply an emotional affect, but rather it is the most fundamental creative force which is responsible for the progression of evolutionary time. As Isaiah experienced the divine throne and seraphim, he came to be overwhelmed by a sense of grief, tormented by his own sense of fallenness and impurity. One of the seraphim then brought a burning stone from the temple altar to Isaiah's lips. This act was a kind of ritualistic purification and seems to have been the completion of Isaiah's initiation as a prophet. With the burning stone, we see yet another kind of syzygy of opposites, the unification of fire and earth, which we also examined previously in the archetype of Vulcan. Recall again the significance of future Vulcan within Rudolf Steiner's cosmology, the final stage in the Christification of our solar system. You might also recall the vision imparted to a certain Galahad Eridanus of the seraphim within the center of the stellar cathedral. Ultimately, what the burning winged serpent represents is the spiritualization of the human ego and, by extension, the entirety of our world. Extrapolating from this, I would argue that the Seraph also represents the human spirit as it existed prior to its ingression into the biological human body, prior to the emergence of human ideational consciousness, and thus the emergence of the embodied human capacity for self-conceptualization. Our solar system was effectively a homogeneous ocean of subjectivity. All organisms moved within the all-encompassing oneness of I amness, or in other words, the archaic structure of consciousness. Much like the recursion of the Ouroboros, the oneness of Adam Kadmon and the unified multiplicity of future Vulcan are mirror images of one another. The seraphim are representatives of the alpha and omega of evolutionary time. The deep past and deep future are mutually implicating, contained within one and the same archetypal image. The serpent itself, then, condemned to crawl upon the earth, is the embodied human subjectivity which arose through the ideational faculty of the biological human body, the emergence of corporeal I amness. Following this awakening of ideation and subjectivity within the human body, the human spirit was no longer shaping biology from above. Previously, the human principle had structured reality as an archetypal, organizational principle of the pleroma, but now, the human principle had become manifest within embodied self-conceptualization. The winged serpent had descended into the corporeal, and would now crawl upon the surface of the earth. Within the Book of Moses, the titular prophet encounters a burning bush while shepherding his flock. The burning bush then speaks to Moses, and the voice informs him that it is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one true God of the Hebrew peoples. This deity, as yet unnamed, announces that it will send Moses to the Pharaoh of Egypt and bring about the liberation of the Hebrews. Moses then asks this deity for its name. Quote, "If they ask me what is his name, what shall I say to them?" The burning bush then replies with the phrase, Eya Asher Eya. This simple yet seemingly cryptic statement has been translated in innumerable ways, as I am what I am, as I am that I am, as I will be what I will be, and many other variations. But immediately following this statement, the deity adds, "Say to the Hebrews, Eya has sent me to you." This seems to rather clearly indicate that the above statement is actually far more literal than most translations would imply. The deity is quite bluntly stating that its name is I am. As such, a much clearer translation might be I am the I am, or even I am I amness. Taken in isolation, such a translation might seem almost nonsensically cryptic, but contextualized by the narrative of cosmic and human evolution, which we have illustrated over the course of this series, we can see the immense profundity contained within this simple utterance. I amness is the recursive, conceptual self-apprehending of the pure awareness, which is being itself. It is subjectivity, and subjectivity is the logos, which breathes life into the infinite oneness of the deep. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was I. The journey of human evolution is the intensification of this same narrative as individuated human subjectivity comes to realize itself and thus comes to mirror within its own particularity the same creative power which also characterizes the universality of cosmic consciousness. That creative power in all its cosmic sublimity and cosmic horror is love. In the previous video, we noted that as the absolute becomes subjectivity through self-reflection, it comes to take on a fourfold, cruciform structure. The I itself is the form of unity, which is felt by the formless awareness of the Cora, or prima materia. These two principles, representing the essences of the ideal and the manifest respectively, interpenetrate so as to give rise to the world of thought forms, or spirits on the one hand, and corporeal embodiment on the other. Together, these four aspects give us the basic blueprint of the four elements, while the whole which they constitute gives us the fifth element. This cruciform structure is the logos, and it is also the innermost core of the human soul. This inner core is characterized by the pure formedness of the monad, the form of unity itself, but also by the formlessness of the Cora, the inner darkness which, as we have seen, is pure awareness. It is an absolute receptivity to experience, pure feeling. This formless inner darkness is also pure willing, pure eros, as it is the vacuity, discordance, or chaos which strives to negate itself through blending itself with form. Here we thus have a polarity consisting of embodied immanent eros and the transcendental attractor, which is the concept of unity, the form of synthesis, as it were. These two principles interpenetrate one another, and what arises is love. The undifferentiated oneness of reality splits itself into multiplicity through self-reflection, but within the basic structure of this subjectivity we find the will unto the synthesis of self and otherness. The most basic structure of reality is a striving towards numinosity. However, before we all begin holding hands and singing Kumbaya, we should once again return to the Garden of Eden, wherein we see the immense tragedy of the human logos. After eating from the fruit of knowledge, Adam and Eve are said to have become aware of their own nakedness, and then attempted to clothe themselves. We could interpret this need for clothing as indicating a rather sexually connotated sense of shame, and I do believe that to be a part of the picture here, but more fundamentally, I believe this to indicate a sense of existential vulnerability. Subjectivity itself is a kind of syzygy of opposites. It is both pure form, in the sense that the I is the concept of unity, and pure formlessness. As such, it is pure receptivity to feeling. As we have seen, the liquidity associated with warmth and formlessness is sensitivity, while the solidity associated with coolness and densification is anesthesia, numbness. This liquid sensitivity is characteristic of youth and comes to densify and become more numb with age. The human ego is much like a complex of nested Matryoshka dolls. As we mature, the ego comes to create new layers or shells around its inner core. The inner core is the most formless, most receptive to feeling, and as such, the most vulnerable part of the human organism. The layers created around this inner core are increasingly densified. They have more rigid definition as they are informed by more complex archetypal configurations. To feel is to be changed by that which is felt. All experience is the informing of the formlessness that is awareness itself. Unfired clay is highly malleable. It can be shaped very easily by hand. Fired, hardened clay, conversely, is already informed and thus much less easily transformed. Analogously, because the outer layers of the human ego are more determinate, more hardened, as it were, they are less susceptible to change. They are more rigid and, as such, more anesthetized, less vulnerable to pain and trauma. These shells, which the human ego creates in order to protect and conceal its own inner vulnerability, are, I believe, what is really being indicated by the clothing which Adam and Eve adorn themselves with following their attainment of the knowledge of good and evil. This sense of their own nakedness is ultimately their awareness of their own vulnerability following their attainment of self-conceptualization. It is here, then, that we find the true tragedy of Eden. Subjectivization results in a seemingly infinite gulf between self and otherness, between the interiority of subjectivity and the exteriority of alterity. Yet the ultimate teleological attractor of subjectivity, and thus of reality itself, is the form of unity, which draws us unto the syzygy of inner and outer. The very concept of I, as well as the existential alienation of selfhood, necessitate a will unto the reconciliation of self and other, a cosmic love which is both infinite beauty and infinite terror. It is often said that the human subject is forever contained within the bounds of its own private consciousness, that we are effectively imprisoned within the confines of our own subjectivity and can never truly make contact with reality in itself, let alone the private inner worlds of other creatures. Following the Cartesian bifurcation of mind and matter, this solipsistic isolation came to be seen as almost tautological and would later be codified within Immanuel Kant's demarcation of the phenomenal and noumenal domains of existence. How could it even be possible to bridge the divide between self and other? As it just so happens, I believe that there is, in fact, an answer to this question, but in order to bring this answer to light, we now need to look more carefully at a mystery which we have been gradually circling in upon over the course of this entire series: the mystery of Golgotha. In the previous episode, I discussed the manner in which the archetype of the father tends to form the basis of a child's idealized self-conception, what Freud would have termed the ego ideal, or what I have referred to as the stellar soul. This father archetype is identified with the principle of form, the ultimate metaform or form of formedness, which we see in the notion of the monad or the one. Given the bifurcation of form and formlessness, this heavenly father came to be defined in opposition to the formless chaos which was understood to underpin all embodied corporeal existence. As mythical consciousness gave way to discursive consciousness, the Heavenly Father came to be an ideal which was essentially unrealizable by definition. The human soul came to find that its own value was determined by its contrast with an ideal which simply could not be lived up to. Any hope of redemption would have to be found in the disavowal of embodied existence, an escape into an idyllic world which seemed to reside forever beyond our grasp as embodied beings. Although the discursive structure developed in polar opposite ways within Eastern and Western civilizations, this inclination towards rejecting the particularity of one's own embodied actuality was a theme common to both East and West. In the life of Christ, what we initially seem to see is a person who is against all odds committed to doing the impossible, a person who is willing to surrender absolutely everything in order to live up to this impossible ideal. Within the Romanized forms of Christianity, this is interpreted in a rather blunt manner. Jesus of Nazareth is said to have been fully God, and therefore he was a literally perfect being from cradle to grave, or cradle to glorified resurrection, as the case may be. As we examined previously, this interpretation results in some rather intractable paradoxes within the traditional Western bifurcation of form and formlessness. Western metaphysics regarded material embodiment as a kind of imperfection by definition. Materiality was understood to be the ingression of the perfect, eternal forms into the formless chaos of the Chora. The indeterminacy of the Chora was understood to be the gap between the ideal and the manifest. This great mother, as Plato describes her, was therefore seen as a kind of contamination which was responsible for all of our pain, anxiety, and fallenness. Within such a context, the notion that Jesus of Nazareth was both fully God and fully man is quite nearly incomprehensible. How could it be that a living, breathing human being, born from the physical womb of a human woman no less, could be a perfect embodiment of a divine principle which was defined in opposition to embodied existence itself. The paradox of the God-man, the sheer absurdity within this defiance of the boundaries between the universal and the particular, is a confrontation which bridges the gulf between the ideal and the actual. The crucifixion of Christ is a reconciliation which is achieved through entering into and being annihilated by the gap between what should be and what is. It is a confrontation with the syzygy of light and darkness, which is in fact the ultimate generative power of reality itself. There is far, far more to be said about the life of Christ than I could possibly attempt to unravel in a single video, but one particular detail of this story is, I believe, of immense relevance to the narrative of this series. Upon the cross, within his dying moments, Christ is said to have stated, O Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" One can hardly imagine a more haunting refrain, so here we must ask, how could it be that a person who was somehow an embodiment of God was able to feel abandoned by God? Typical Christian interpretations tend to presume that the man Jesus himself must have been omnipotent and omniscient despite being somehow contained within a human body. As such, the above statement tends to be interpreted as something merely allegorical, merely a metaphorical reference towards the Psalms or a purely symbolic gesture of some sort. Yet the gospel story also indicates that Christ wept, that he experienced agony, and prayed to, presumably, the great Sky Father deity who was, presumably, also himself. Was this all no more than symbolic gesture? Was Christ simply going through these motions while knowing internally that he was in fact the deity which he was praying to, and that all of the apparent pain, doubt, and fear was no more than performance? A much more plausible, direct, and penetrating interpretation, in my opinion, is that all of this was quite real, that Jesus of Nazareth was indeed fully God, as we shall see, and also ultimately he was simply just an ordinary man. Given what we are shown of his internal world, Jesus of Nazareth was a completely ordinary, embodied human being who was quite capable of fear, anger, pain, doubt, and, of course, the sense of abandonment, which we saw at the very initiation of this story in the fall from Eden. As such, I don't believe that the words, "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" should be taken as a merely performative gesture, nor should they be taken as a brief moment of frailty and weakness. Rather, these words represent the ultimate climax of the entire narrative which has played out thus far. What these words represent is the crossing of a final threshold within a descent into the inner abyss of consciousness. Christ is asking, I believe quite earnestly, whither is God? And the answer is, paradoxically, that he is dying, nailed to a piece of wood. What we have established thus far is that the basic structure of human subjectivity is in fact a manifestation of cosmic I-amness within embodied particularity. It is through the human body that this universal subjectivity comes to be individuated. It is this fall, which is the sense of abandonment and alienation, which is the driving force at the core of the human religious impulses, our resentment towards being itself, the will to master the earth, as well as our sexual and romantic drives. But in order to be truly complete, this human subjectivity must become fully aware of itself as subjectivity. It must not only come to an awareness of itself as an inner world of experience, but also come to the realization that this inner world is in fact the embodiment of the Logos, which generates reality. This realization, however, is easier said than done, precisely because of the clothing which human subjectivity creates in order to protect its own inner vulnerability. In order for this realization to occur, this clothing, these ego complexes which encase our subjectivity like armored shells, must be broken down or stripped away. It is this breakdown, this emptying, which we see in the brutal execution of Jesus of Nazareth. It is precisely in these final moments that Christ is utterly annihilated by love. Subjectivity becomes aware of itself as pure abjectivity, a pure vulnerability within which subjectivity can no longer shield itself from its own inner abyss of formlessness. Although the crossing of the final threshold might be contained within Christ's final words, the truly penultimate confrontation is something which we do not see in the Gospel accounts. The final transformation is one which occurs internally, within the consciousness of Christ as he descends into the realm of the dead. We are shown the results of this theosis, but the true confrontation with the abjectivity of subjectivity is something which cannot be shown. It must be experienced. The rest of the story could never have been told on paper, and as such, it is instead being told within us. Is it thus any surprise, then, that the unconscious Christic impulse destroyed medieval Christendom from the inside out? Is it any surprise that this collapse was heralded by the transformation of the biblical I am into the Cartesian I am? Is it any wonder that the climax of that breakdown was encapsulated in the life of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose entire life was a dramatic reenactment of "Father, why hast thou forsaken me?" Is it any wonder that the Christification of the planet Earth, the skull of Adam, would be prefigured by its crucifixion, or as Martin Heidegger would put it, the unworlding of the world? In the previous episode, we saw the way in which the entire trajectory of Western metaphysics has been oriented towards a kind of reconciliation of form and formlessness, within which we came to see that the world of forms itself is not a static, crystalline realm of inert, eternal objects, but rather a living, breathing pleroma of fluid, composite images which are characterized by the very same temporality and indeterminacy which characterize the corporeal world. Ultimately, what we came to see is that thought, noesis, is not merely a passive apprehension of static transcendental objects, but rather an active, creative process by which thought forms, noemata, are actually generated through the process of conceptualization. Memories of particulars are synthesized so as to generate the composite images which are then the blueprints of subsequent creativity. Moreover, this realization was only possible following the internalization of thought itself, which began with the medieval nominalists, was consummated by the Cartesian bifurcation of nature, and brought to its logical extreme by Nietzsche's philosophy of immanence. We came to see ideas as actively brought into experience by the mind, rather than as contents of the world which were simply given for observation. It was then possible to see conceptualization itself as a creative power of subjectivity. This internalization also resulted in an extreme alienation from reality, as this resulted in a perspectival relativism that threatened to tear the world asunder. We came to feel that thought was the exclusive purview of human subjectivity, and that the relativity of thought implied a lack of any genuine truth which could underpin it. As the perspectival structure of consciousness reached its zenith, the human ego found itself within the suffocating constriction of a metaphysical birth canal. Now, however, we can begin to see the light at the end of that tunnel, though it may be that human beings do have a monopoly upon individuated subjectivity. We do not have a monopoly upon subjectivity itself, or indeed upon thought itself. Thought is much more than neural computation, or whatever terminology is in vogue among cognitive science nerds this week. Consciousness is much more than a mere epiphenomenal vapor expelled as an accidental byproduct of brain activity. Feeling is becoming itself. The capacity for feeling is both being itself and nothingness itself. Thought is the ultimate generative power through which the conceptual and corporeal domains of reality interpenetrate and co-generate one another. By moving through the death and rebirth of perspectival consciousness, human subjectivity is now able to become fully aware of its own innermost nature, and as such, is now able to realize its own inner freedom in terms of creative, intellectual, and moral agency. The realization of that freedom is theosis. And through such self-realization, we will come to achieve the powers needed to re-world the Earth that techno-capitalism has so violently and rapaciously unworlded. In the next video, we are going to examine the structure of consciousness which will necessarily follow the perspectival age and the various pitfalls which we will find along that path. In doing so, we will cast clearer light on the perspectival age itself, as well as the archetypal forces which have shaped this entire journey since our departure from Eden. Thanks for watching.